anyway, so yeah, so my project is rocky desert geological mapping and slope surface change detection within the cloud to inform urban development in the Medina region of northwestern Saudi Arabia. So my project was actually a vocational project between Durham and Arup, who are a consulting engineering firm with offices all around the world, really. So, oh, hang on, that's not working. Yeah, so here's a brief, just an overview of how I'm going to talk through this. Firstly, I'll just give you an idea of my actual study area in northwestern Saudi Arabia. Then I'll go through the two main sort of brackets of my results and just a bit of a discussion with those. So that's the baseline geological mapping that I did to start off with, and then move on to the change detection on the rocky slopes that I moved on to. And then I'll just give you a few conclusions that I came to and sort of where sort of potential next steps in my research going forward. Yeah, so this is my study area in the northwestern Saudi Arabia. And essentially it's an area of rocky desert where you've got the underlying bedrock in the bottom here with, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the main town in the bottom, and then these elevated plateaus and mesas higher up. And essentially, this project was designed to contribute to a project that Arup have at the moment, contributing to an urban development and sort of tourism destination that they're hoping to produce, centered around Madin Saleh, which is an ancient Nabatean settlement and sort of cultural heritage site, similar to Petra in Jordan, which is a couple of kilometers south of the main town of Al Ula, which is where a lot of the infrastructure is based. So yeah, this is one of the main outputs that I produced first of all, which is using Aster's sort of an optical satellite. And this is an Aster composite, false color composite image. And I basically, essentially satellite data is multi-band because the sensors within the satellite, on board the satellite, detect light at lots of different wavelengths. And each band within the satellite image represents quite a small range of wavelengths that the satellite detects. So if you display multiple bands within an image, you can sort of display the light detected at different wavelengths on top of each other and mix them together. And this composite is using sort of band ratioing. So I've divided the bands within the satellite image between each other to sort of highlight particular features that I'm interested in. So in this image, you've got essentially the bedrock in the bottom and towards the south and the east. And then you've got rocky, like exposed sandstone slopes in the white to the east and the west of the main town. And then a plateau, which is the highest spots in the really deep purples, particularly in the northwest, which is sort of earlier volcanic rock, later volcanic rock. And then you've got the actual settlement, which is mainly Al Ula, and then Madin Saleh in the far north, in the oranges. So as I say, when I sort of produced these images, I got a sense of the amount of rocky sandstone exposure in the landscape, and I wanted to investigate that further, and particularly investigate changes within them due to rainfall events. Oh, I should say as well, so I produced the actual images themselves in Google Earth Engine, which is sort of a cloud-based platform for doing satellite processing, image processing, basically. And then I moved them over. I took everything into QGIS, which is sort of an analysis software package, to do sort of the formatting and some of the more fine detail investigation. Because the idea of the project from the outset really was to show the value of Google Earth Engine to Arup for their projects. Because with having the cloud-based platform like I've used, you've really got an accessible platform which you can use in the field, you know, just with an iPad or a laptop or something, which is especially useful with COVID, given that you can do it entirely remotely and you don't need sort of really intense computing power. So that was the idea, really. So as I say, this is the baseline geological mapping side that I did first of all, and then I moved on to sort of looking at change detection, particularly on the rocky slopes within the study area. So essentially what I did was produce a slope map of the same study area you've just seen in Google Earth Engine. And in this image here, you've got the areas of the highest gradients in the white, and then the flattest surfaces in the dark. So basically, I used random sampling to produce a set of points on the rocky slopes within the study area. And I picked out the rainfall regime at those points over 2019. And along with those, I then compiled the radar backscatter change data set and an optical data set over the same period at each of those points. And the idea was essentially to detect whether you could correlate a change in rainfall, so like a really high intense rainfall event, with a change in the satellite data, the backscatter and the reflectance. And essentially I did find changes which suggest that you can use satellite imagery to detect small scale changes caused by rainfall. So essentially the radar showed statistically significant changes only with the very high intensity rainfall events. So this was the event which produced the most significant changes was something like 10 millimeters of rainfall over the course of a few days, compared to a background average of sort of multiple decimal points of rainfall over that same period. So you had, you know, you only had the changes in the backscatter with the very intense rainfall events, while the optical data was much more ubiquitous. You saw changes even with the smaller rainfall events and sort of light showers. And essentially that suggests, therefore, that there's kind of a threshold rainfall volume above which you would detect change in backscatter. But in terms of my specific project, there wasn't really enough of a big enough sample size to test whether that hypothesis was correct. So a main area for future research would be to expand this over multiple years to see whether these results would be reproducible. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. So essentially, some of my main conclusions were really that Rocky Desert is a much more diverse and dynamic landscape type than you maybe perhaps would first imagine. I think a lot of people would sort of imagine it to be quite static and unchanging. Google Earth Engine was a really valuable resource for investigating geomorphology. And one of the main things I recommended to Arup was to investigate it further for use within their projects. And then finally, the optical and radar data sets would be complementary resources for mapping geological zonation and understanding landscape dynamics, landscape change over time. Yeah, thank you very much.
Woo! Clap, clap, clap.
Virtual clap.
It's so weird not being able to clap when someone finishes a talk.
Thank you very much.
But yeah, thank you, Nat. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. Nat, my question is, you said that the studies can be done remotely. To what extent would you say you can complete a thorough investigation without actually going to these deserts?
Well, that's sort of a balance, isn't it? I think you certainly can. I guess the point is that a lot more maybe can be done than you would first think remotely, and it's certainly a valuable resource. I mean, you're never going to be able to, a site visit is always useful, and it's going to just give you a much broader picture of what's actually going on. But certainly as a first step, as sort of an initial sighting, assessment of whether or not you would need a site visit potentially, these sort of approaches can potentially be really useful.
That's cool.
Any other questions for Nat? Can be anything. Nothing is a stupid question.
What is a desert?
I have one that's quite stupid, but what's an alluvial fan?
Oh, sorry. I realised I've had to cut loads of this out. So essentially, an alluvial fan is a product of erosion. So particularly in this desert, you've got very infrequent rainfall, but when it happens, it's sort of really intense. So these are producing sort of ephemeral streams, which is like watercourses, only over a very short period of time, which then erode the stream channels that they're in. Mm-hmm. So an alluvial fan basically is the deposition of that sediment that's picked up from the erosion, because the streams are eroding the surface and then drying out and depositing all the sand and the sediment.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
So what other technological applications for remotely studying this phenomenon are available? Like, would you be able to use machine learning to try to predict the patterns or the direction of this erosion?
I think you certainly could, yeah. That would be another really interesting area to look into. Because I mean, my project was really just quite a basic overview of what you could potentially do with remote sensing. My next step would really be to automate it further, so produce a few algorithms, probably within Google Earth Engine or maybe a Python program, to make more, rather than just pick out, say, I chose like 30 points just as an initial test, but a much bigger sample size using something like, an algorithm to produce like a change map would be really useful as like a next step, definitely. And there's so many areas you can go into with that. I mean, I looked at deserts, but I mean, there's so many applications. People are using it for, forest change and wildfires, ice cap change. Yeah, it's a really interesting area.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you, Nat, for that. But yeah, I think Annabelle's after, but just wanted to say, like, everyone who's joined, thank you for coming, and this will hopefully help introduce you to like the format and just generally what the research forums are that we try and run throughout the year. And if any of you decide to run for the academic officer for the MCR, then like you'll be organising these. And yeah, so it's usually like around 20-minute talks with some questions afterwards. But it's a really like informal setting, so you can really use it for anything public speaking wise. Like you could use it to practice your public speaking, you could use it to maybe present a research idea, to practice for your Viva, literally anything. So yeah, thank you for that, Nat, and yeah, Annabelle.
My screen.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I'm a bit of a grandma. Share screen.
Oh,
Okay.
and also, when we do these like in person, we always have free cheese and wine, so it's definitely worth coming to them, if just for that, you know, the social aspect. But yeah.
Can you see okay?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, I shall start. So yeah, I've just really tried to summarize my dissertation. It was quite tricky, so I just tried to draw out the main points in each of my chapters. So I'm not presenting a whole argument as such, just the points that I found the most interesting. But the title of my dissertation was this lengthy sentence: Entrenching Patriarchy, the Gendering of Space, Institutional Oppression, and the Commodification of the Female Body in Pride and Prejudice and Roxana. When I refer to the gendering of space, I am referring to the idea, the traditional patriarchal idea that women belong in the home and men belong in the urban, capitalistic, public sphere. And I discuss kind of how that varies and how that's interchangeable, challenged, reinforced in both the novels. Okay, so this is my summary of the first chapter. So I'll just run through it. It's probably generally understood that women in the 18th and 19th centuries were always within the domestic sphere. They were secondary to their husbands, fathers, elder brothers, but that's not necessarily always the case in Roxana and Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is a particularly interesting case because there are quite a lot of critics that read Austen as very conservative, but equally you will find, if you look, a whole band of scholars who would argue instead that Austen is very radical. So that was quite interesting to look at these two different sides and how that relates to the women's inhabitation of space. There is a theorist, Raymond Williams, who he discusses space and the individual's position within it, and he doesn't explicitly align the male gender with urban space, but he aligns traditional masculine traits and activities like communication and learning, because obviously education has traditionally been a very male-dominated space. The woman, in contrast, is aligned with the rural space with purity, calmness, serenity. And that's also very interesting to read in relation to both Pride and Prejudice and Roxana. Like if you think about Pride and Prejudice, for example, the proper wooing and kind of courting, so to speak, all happens in the rural space, in rural Hertfordshire. But, for example, Lydia and Wickham, their elopement takes them to London where they are concealed. And that is obviously probably the biggest scandal in the novel. So you could say that in that sense, the proper, pure woman belongs in the rural scene, and the immoral and, I hate to say undesirable, but in the context of these novels, undesirable women will belong kind of elsewhere in the urban scene. In Roxana, it's almost portrayed as the case because Defoe is a very conservative writer. But Roxana, I don't know if any of you have read it, but Roxana tells the story of the woman who is abandoned by her husband. She's left destitute and she's effectively forced to prostitute herself to survive. But because she's a very beautiful woman, she's able to attract some very wealthy men. She ends up the mistress of a very wealthy German prince and subsequently very well off herself. And because she's very well off, independently. She's allowed to exist alongside these male peers in the urban space. She kind of travels around a lot of European cities, but never as a proper woman. She is kind of denounced at the end. She retrospectively says that her conduct is immoral and women do belong within the domestic scene, domestic space. So yes, sorry, I'm not making this overly clear. It's kind of hard to summarize into one slide. But yeah, to just refer to a key quote that really kind of drew my attention in the novel. Roxana declared when one of the men proposed to her that she would be a man-woman. She was born free and she would die so. And man-woman is obviously quite a loaded term, especially in regards to 17th century gender politics, because there wasn't really such thing as man-woman. You were either supposed to be a man or a woman and exist as such, by kind of androgynizing herself and forming this quasi-masculine persona. She was warping her identity, and that is something that Defoe really kind of concentrates on. What is the correct way in which somebody should perform their gender and should exist, and where they should exist within contemporary society for the time. Move on to chapter 2. It's probably not overly surprising. Marriage is a subjugating institution. In both Roxana and Pride and Prejudice, marriage formally and legally entrenches the woman's inferiority. Interestingly and unsurprisingly, all women do end up married. Elizabeth rebels against the immediate requirement for her marriage by rejecting Mr. Collins as an undesirable match and an emotionally unfulfilling match. And in doing so, she rebels against kind of the practical need for a woman to marry to secure her own socio-economic survival. But she can only rebel to such an extent because obviously she is a woman in a patriarchal society and has to end up married. Roxana, on the other hand, marries despite kind of existing independently to a limited extent, because obviously she's still dependent on these male figures, but she looks back at it as preferable and moral. I would also say in Pride and Prejudice, marriage is inevitable, as I've said, but it also kind of serves the additional purpose of punishing and rewarding female conduct. Obviously, Elizabeth and Jane marry well. One marries the wealthy Bingley and Elizabeth marries Darcy. And they're very well off, very comfortable, have lovely houses. They do ultimately end up inferior to their husbands, but they do retain a degree of agency of their own as well. But in contrast, Lydia, who marries Wickham, the libertine she eloped to London with, she is kind of doomed to this emotionally unsatisfying and financially unstable marriage. So yeah, marriage is oppressive and kind of punishing and rewarding as well. Chapter 3. The casual commodification of the female body. Yeah, so in this chapter, I was kind of focusing more on the informal and exploitative general ways in which male characters impose their patriarchal superiority on the female characters in both Defoe and Austen's novels, as opposed to the formal subjugation of the women through marriage, through the institution of marriage. As I've already said, Roxana had to effectively prostitute herself to secure her survival. But she also, just refer you to this second little point here. She really tries to assert her own superiority over even her fellow female characters, which is quite interesting because obviously in the 17th century, which is when Roxana was written, the marriage market was a thing and women had to be the most visually and just generally desirable. They had to be wanted by eligible men to marry. But she asserted her own superiority by referring to the women as slaves that she owned effectively, and she was just generally superior to. So in doing so, there is an element there that Roxana's suggesting her own masculine, quasi-masculine superiority over these women. So yeah, more so than just kind of, I'm prettier than you and I'm gonna have a better husband. In regards to Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and Jane are commodified by their mother, interestingly, rather than their father. She is the one who really pushes for their advantageous marriages to secure the family's fortunes, because obviously once Mr. Bennet dies, the Longbourn estate and all of his money will go to the next heir male, which would be Mr. Collins. But he's not the most effective patriarchal figure, so it actually goes to Mrs. Bennet. The responsibility to secure the family survival falls to Mrs. Bennet. She is forever pushing her two eldest daughters in particular into advantageous marriages, and following Jane's engagement to the wealthy Bingley, Mrs. Bennet declares that she knew Jane could not be so beautiful for nothing, again reiterating that the primary purpose of a woman's image is to marry well, secure the affection of well-off male benefactors, rather than just being kind of for the woman herself. There's that primary, that additional purpose. So whilst obviously the commodification of the female body reiterates the woman's inferiority, there's no way around that. It was kind of interesting to look at Roxana and her own self-commodification, because she did do it very willingly after she'd secured her own survival. She secured the money and the means to survive comfortably. She made the decision to carry on prostituting herself because she quite liked it. She liked the things that she gained from it. So it's kind of interesting to kind of read or kind of examine the extent to which a woman like Roxana could be a masculine and independent figure, because on one hand she is, because she's earned this money and this status and she lives comfortably, but on the other hand she remains completely dependent on these male figures for their affection, for their wealth and their money. So that took up quite a large chunk of my third chapter as well. To just briefly go over some conclusions. As you might expect, female characters can only rebel to a limited extent. They are ultimately entirely beholden to the dominant patriarchal regime. Roxana in particular, and most extremely, is able to exist as this quasi-masculine androgynous persona, but she cannot be absolutely independent because she is entirely dependent on her wealthy male peers for her wealth and status. Jane and Elizabeth Bennet do prioritise their own emotional satisfaction rather than just the socio-economic survival of their families, which works out quite well because they get both, but that's because they behaved properly and well. Again, Lydia Bennet did not behave properly and got a very poor marriage out of it, one that she's kind of doomed to suffer for. Yes, so the novels collectively demonstrate that female characters, are only able to rebel to a limited extent. As I've already said, Roxana denounces her immoral conduct later in the novel, but it is the case all the way through. If you read the preface right at the beginning of the book, Defoe says that Roxana is a very poor example of a woman and you ought not to emulate her behaviour, which was quite interesting. The first time I read Roxana, I didn't actually read the preface first, and I read the whole novel and I thought, oh my goodness, this is strangely feminist for the 17th century. And then I went back and read the preface and I thought, oh no, of course it's not. Shock. And again, Elizabeth is criticised throughout the novel for her gross independence and self-interested priorities, but I suppose they both end up married. There we go, patriarchy. That's it. Anyone have any questions, or is that all okay?
I have a question. I think, first of all, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't read very much like 17th or 18th century literature, but I know that some books of the time, there's a big preoccupation with like virtue, female virtue, and being virtuous, and you see that word thrown around a lot. I wondered if you encountered that at all in your research, and if either author kind of said very much about like a definition of virtuous or female virtue.
Defoe definitely. Austen, I think, as I said, Austen's a little bit, you can read into Austen whichever way you want. I feel like you can definitely say that she's a very conservative writer, but in terms of 17th century novels, definitely. Defoe and Richardson as well, there is this high key emphasis on virtue, and like that being the be all and end all. You can't, like, it's, I don't know if you've read any Richardson, but Pamela in particular is pretty horrific. Like, it's a, I think, teenage girl who is effectively raped, like, continuously, and the idea is she ought to just die rather than kind of give in to, like, succumb. So it's pretty horrible. Yeah, you're right, there is really that heavy emphasis on virtue, and again it comes back to the kind of like moral gender, what constitutes proper femininity, moral femininity, and natural femininity. It's depressingly prominent in 17th century literature, especially in the novels of male authors. Yeah.
Have you by chance read Phantomina by Eliza Haywood?
Eliza Haywood, I've not read that. I read oh my gosh, the other one. I can't remember the name of it. I've not read Phantomina. I've read another one I read for a module earlier in the year.
Oh, okay. Phantomina is quite cool, and a lot of people say that she beats Defoe for writing the first novel, if you count Phantomina as, it's like, it's a novella, but some people argue that it may be the first novel, which I like to think, because she was a woman, and that's quite cool.
No,
but,
definitely. I've heard that as well. I think it's just because obviously being male writers writing in this time, obviously they were given the spotlight. That's not to say that women authors didn't exist, obviously, but because of obviously the culture in which they were writing, they just kind of dominated the spotlight.
But I was just say that Phantomina is quite cool, and how she kind of writes the protagonist, and she ends up becoming a prostitute, but she completely controls like all of her encounters with men, and like she talks about like female sexual pleasure, which I think is just like absolutely mad for, I think it's 18th century, but early 18th century. So I just think that might be an interesting book to kind of think about in comparison to these, and kind of the representation of women and how they're able to transgress kind of patriarchal society, but within these kind of predetermined grounds, which is something you talked about a lot, which I thought was really
definitely. I'll have to read that. It's on my to-read list now.
It's really short as well. I think it's online, and it's like, I don't know, 50 pages maybe.
Oh, perfect.
It's cool.
I'll read it on the train home.
Brilliant.
I had a question as well. How did you come up with the topic for your master's dissertation? Was it something that you wrote about for your undergraduate dissertation, or maybe there was a module that covered gender-related issues? How did you?
I actually am not entirely sure where it came from. My undergrad dissertation was about race relations in Kipling and Henry Rider Haggard, like colonialism. So this is entirely different. I did do a module that focused on patriarchy, but it was more to do with specifically women's writing. But I've always really enjoyed Daniel Defoe and Pride and Prejudice in particular. And I think over like the kind of gap, the summer between my undergrad and starting at Durham, I read quite a lot of feminist theory and feminist novels, and it just kind of really got me thinking. So I just thought, why not give it a go? Especially as obviously we went through the women's writing module, a lot of these ideas came up. So I just thought it would be really interesting to kind of look more specifically at novels written in slightly different timeframes and by authors of different genders, because it is very interesting to compare the position of a male author, a male conservative author, and a maybe conservative, maybe radical female author, depending on how you look at it.
Any other questions?
Me, If you,
Yeah.
yeah. I was just going to ask if if Defoe was really keen to write that preface. What was his main sort of motive for writing Roxana? Was it sort of, don't do this, this is a warning, or what do you think was his main motive?
I would probably, having read the preface, I would probably read Roxana as a sort of conduct book. Conduct books were quite popular among the middle and upper classes during the 17th century, and that would be the audience for which Defoe was writing. But yeah, I would say it's funny because I don't know how a 17th century reader would approach a book, but like I said, I didn't read the preface first. I don't know if they would have done. So I feel like you quite easily could just miss the whole point of the book and go a bit rogue. But presumably they didn't. Presumably they read the preface first and yeah, kind of took Roxana as an intrinsically immoral figure and an example of how a woman ought not to behave.
Yeah, is it a bit sort of like, this is what not to do? Or...
Yeah. Yeah, even when Roxana, because it's written from Roxana's perspective, she is consistently referring to herself as a whore. So even in that kind of sense, she's kind of talking about all of this independence she has, but then she's like, oh yeah, I whored myself and now I'm independent. So even going through, it's dodge. But then we did talk about it quite a lot in seminars. This was at Southampton for my undergrad. And apparently a lot of critics have kind of taken that as Roxana reclaiming this patriarchal narrative and discourse, saying, I'm a whore, what are you going to do about it? But I mean, I wouldn't read it like that, to be honest, because that's not obviously what Defoe meant by it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see how people have interpreted the book.
I have one more question, kind of going off of that, about the preface. Obviously, this is very old, and I guess there wasn't much in terms of writing novels going on with like experimental forms and stuff, but I'm thinking of in Lolita, doesn't Nabokov, he writes like a preface or something that's like or it's a review by like a critic, but it's him and it's like quite playful. Like, is there any chance that Defoe meant this in like the preface in like a, not sarcastic is the word, but is it pretty much 100% that the preface reflects his true thoughts and feelings, or could it have been something more experimental, I suppose? Or do you think that's just him straight up saying like, these are my political views, now here's a book?
Honestly, if you take the preface, Roxana, and then kind of compare it to the majority, if not all, of Defoe's other novels and writings, I would say that you could probably quite reasonably say that that was just his political stance. He just was a misogynist. Yeah. It's horrible, but I know it's so horrible, but I guess you just have to remember that it was 17th century and people were just like that. I wish it was just a joke, but I don't think it was.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you, Annabelle. That was really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope everyone's kind of got some idea now of what the research forums are about. And yeah, so I think we were supposed to have a third speaker, but they weren't able to make it. So that's pretty much the end of the talks. But after, like, everyone's welcome to stay around. I mean, like, after our forums, usually there's a formal and then people come back and then we have like cheese and port and crackers in the MCR. But sadly, it's probably unlikely this year because, you know, the MCR's out of action, and yeah. Maybe, I don't know, if things settle down later in the year, but who knows. Anyway, yeah, so basically, we won't be having any more talks, but people are welcome to stay around and chat, or if anyone has any questions about like the academic chair role, I can answer any of those, or just anything in general, really. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I'll stop recording.
One question: what's up with foundation? You just mute